this morning is to give you an overview of some of the key highlights of UNDP's engagement at the Council session, the 54th session, which just concluded. It's to speak on some of the key thematics that arose, some interesting developments that are relevant to UNDP. It's also to hear from Terence on his specific intervention in relation to Indigenous peoples as an example of engagement at the Council, and also to talk about some interesting country resolutions and thematics that came up. The session was incredibly rich. We cannot touch on everything by any measure this morning. This is very short and sharp overview, but there is an excellent report on the Council and UNDP's engagement at the Council, which is available on Spark Blue, and Rukaya is going to put all the links in the chat now, where you can find a brief executive summary giving an overview of all UNDP's engagement at this Council session, plus much more detail on all of the thematics and points we'll speak about today and many more. So firstly, before handing over to Rukaya, just for those colleagues who perhaps are new to this conversation, the Human Rights Council is the policy-making body sanctioned by the General Assembly, a member state-driven mechanism. It meets 3 times a year to discuss the advancement of human rights globally and has a large 11-point agenda focusing on a range of thematic and topical issues. This was the 3rd and last session of the year. UNDP engages at the Council specifically to provide evidence based on our development work, which is linked to human rights and the human rights-based approach, and these perspectives to policy debates, and to strengthen our partnerships for human rights and sustainability and sustainable development for our strategic engagement across the strategic plan. Of course, many member states participate in the Council. Many of those member states are also our partners, and there's also many other stakeholders. So there's also important visibility aspects of our discussions. So UNDP delivered 5 statements at this last Council session. You can see them on the slide in front of you. We were referenced in over 23 reports that were compiled by special procedure mandate holders, by the office, by the various reporting processes. So this is an indicative of how valued UNDP's research, advocacy and work is in the discussions on human rights. And you can find all this information in the report. But to go to some of the specific key highlights, I'm going to hand over to Rukaya now. And thanks very much to Rukaya, who also compiled the report, which is an excellent read. I do recommend you have a look at it beyond this chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, colleagues. I'll start with some thematic highlights before we move into the country highlights. So, as mentioned by Sarah, the 54th session started in September, 11th of September, and ran until the 14th of October. And when the session started, of course, there was the earthquake in Morocco, and towards the end of the session, the Gaza-Israel crisis dominated the discussion. Elisa, I think you can put down the slide. Thank you. So usually at the beginning of the Council session, the High Commissioner for Human Rights presents his oral update, and he did so this time as well. And he updated on human rights challenges, but also solutions. And I'll mention some of the main highlights from his oral update, which included a focus on the right to development and the role of financial institutions, especially integrating just transition and achieving the SDGs, the right to a healthy environment, advocating for equitable environmental burden sharing, and the transition to a human rights-based green economy. He also discussed the challenges posed by new technology, and you'll hear there was a resolution on the right to privacy. And in particular, he highlighted the role of misinformation. And then he also, in his oral update, mentioned the human rights situation in several countries, and we'll get to that. So in terms of key thematic areas for UNDP and where we engaged and followed the discussions, the first I would like to mention is on youth and human rights. And this was discussed at a dedicated panel focusing on young people's engagement with climate change and global environmental decision-making processes. And here, UNDP delivered a statement specifically calling for enhanced youth participation in environmental decision-making. And also the statement highlighted the Climate Promise Initiative, through which UNDP supports 20 plus countries with prioritizing youth and climate commitments. So that was on youth and human rights. Another point that was mentioned during the panel discussion was the role of the need for practical steps and intersectionality in human rights approaches in global climate, and biodiversity specifically was stressed. So just wanted to mention that as well. Another key thematic area that we engaged on is reprisals, and specifically intimidation and reprisals against collaboration with the UN. And during this interactive dialogue that was presented, the report by the Secretary General, which noted a growing tendency towards self-censorship and also an increase in reported cases of reprisals. So the report highlighted that there is more anonymous reporting and increased risk for specifically indigenous people cooperating with the UN bodies. So it's becoming harder and harder for human rights activists, indigenous people, etc., when they engage with the UN. And here UNDP delivered a statement specifically reaffirming our commitment to supporting human rights defenders and our work with human rights defenders and civil society, and also our efforts to include collaboration with national human rights institutions, the business sector, and environmental programs, which are crucial for achieving the SDGs. A resolution was adopted on reprisals, and the resolution urges all states to prevent and refrain from all acts of intimidation and reprisals, both online but also offline, specifically against those seeking to cooperate or have cooperated with the UN. And then another thematic area that we followed closely was on racism and people of African descent. And during this session, so the 54th session, there were various interactive dialogues and panels specifically on racism. So there were about 4 or 5 that we followed. And just some key highlights from the discussions and the interactive dialogues that took place include the necessity to reimagine policing and accountability mechanisms, which were stressed, but also advancing racial justice and equality by uprooting systemic racism. And then finally, also a discussion around specifically xenophobia and related intolerances, where a resolution was adopted on against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. And the resolution specifically calls upon states to ensure proper accountability measures and reparations for human rights at borders, and also to adopt a racial justice approach. So these are some of the thematic areas. Another thematic area was on indigenous peoples, and we have Terence here with us, who engaged at the council through us, so prepared statements specifically on indigenous people, and I'll pass over to Terence to talk more about this area.
Thank you, Rukaya. So indigenous people's rights, there were 2 particular sessions. One was a dedicated panel, and then the second one was an interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, as well as with the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, the MRIP. Some of the themes are on the role and prioritization of indigenous women's rights and their inclusion in decision-making. Among the different issues that were raised were land rights, environmental conservation, cultural preservation, economic empowerment as linked with indigenous people's rights, and I'll say something in a minute about the CBD negotiations last week as well on some of those topics. So for this, UNDP delivered a statement sharing the outcome of the recent joint report between UNDP and UN Women, describing over 30 gender-responsive solutions by governments, which also highlighted the importance of indigenous peoples' rights for their implementation. We also highlighted the climate promise and the new nature pledge, and UNDP expressed just transition, including indigenous women. So this topic of a just transition came up again in the interactive dialogue with the special rapporteur, focusing on the impact. So this came from the MREP in July, which was on the impact of militarization on the rights of indigenous peoples, as well as green financing. So this topic of green financing is being explored. There was meant to be a workshop in Guatemala this year by UNDESA and the UN Permanent Forum on indigenous issues, which is being pushed next year. So in the interactive dialogue, the special rapporteur highlighted a need for breaking down power asymmetries, characterizing aid and development financing mechanisms, as well as the critical role of indigenous people's knowledge in addressing biodiversity issues. The UNDP delivered a statement supporting a UN-wide approach to green financing and emphasizing state responsibility. UNDP advocated for recognizing indigenous people's rights in national development plans and its aim to advance environmental governance with them as active partners in a just transition. So finally, a resolution on human rights and indigenous peoples was adopted, aiming at increasing participation of indigenous communities in international fora. It encourages states to give due consideration to the rights of indigenous peoples and to all forms of violence and discrimination, including multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination faced by indigenous peoples and individuals. It stresses the need to pay particular attention to the rights and needs of indigenous women, children, young persons, older persons, persons with disabilities, and persons in vulnerable situations, and to intensify efforts to prevent and eliminate all forms of violence and discrimination in this regard. Finally, I think I'm probably running out of time, Sarah, but just to mention that last week, the UNCBD was discussing the role of traditional knowledge in line with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and there's a target 22 on governance, where the particular role of environmental human rights defenders was discussed, and text has been presented to track the situation of environmental human rights defenders in the Kunming GBF, but the text wasn't agreed and has been pushed to next year to the COP16 of the CBD. So handing back to you, Sarah. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Terence. Didn't mean to rush you by turning my camera on. Thanks for this overview. We really wanted to highlight the fact that the Human Rights Council is not just relevant for the rule of law, security and human rights team. The topics that are discussed are wide-ranging across UNDP's strategic plan and our mandate. And there's a great focus on issues around environment, Indigenous peoples, many issues, and the participation of Terence in the Nature Hub consistently in the conversations on the Council highlights how important the discussions can be, and for us to bring also our experience to the discussions from the development lens. So thanks for doing that, Terence, consistently. A couple of other things we wanted to mention at this point, and please put any questions you have in the chat. After I stop talking, we'll open the floor for anyone to share any of their perspectives and views. A couple of other important developments at the Council we want to stress were on the right to development. There were a number of conversations around the right to development, and some important new reports as well were released. The chair rapporteur of the expert group on the right to development released 3 reports on social protection, on investment, and on the duty to cooperate with non-state actors. They're all quite interesting, particularly the last one. As many, of course, as we're working consistently with non-state actors in our work. There's also a new special rapporteur on the right to development. He was appointed in the previous Human Rights Council session, Surya Deva, who previously was the chair of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, so a lot of experience leading Human Rights Council mandates. and he is the new Special Rapporteur on the right to development, and he outlined his vision for his mandate and how he's going to support the right to development globally. And he outlined a number of issues, but he really stressed the criticality of mainstreaming the right to development across the UN system. He talked extensively about the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and making those active linkages between the right to development and the Sustainable Development Goals. He talked about reinvigorating the discourse around the right to development, which at times has been a bit stagnating in previous years, which is encouraging. And he also mentioned that he wants to produce a number of short, sharp policy briefs and guidance on specific issues alongside the right to development over the next period. So I think this is quite an encouraging perspective from the new Special Rapporteur. We obviously engaged with him quite extensively on a number of fronts, but it was good to see such a practical approach coming from that mandate. And UNDP issued a statement there welcoming this vision essentially and talking about our Human Development Report and the work we're doing on the SDGs and so on. I should mention all the statements that that we've referenced here are all available on the Spark Blue page, and you can have a look at them as well. They're very short documents, only 3 or 4 paragraphs, but they give you a bit of a sense of our response to many of these issues at the Council. Another important development in relation to the right to development was that a resolution was passed essentially putting forth an intergovernmental covenant draft for consideration of the General Assembly on the right to development. This has been pending for about 12 years. So it's quite a significant development that finally a resolution was passed, not uncontentiously, but still passed, to advance the discussions on a potential binding covenant on the right to development, which will be taken up by the General Assembly Third Committee next year, with a view to potentially finalising such an instrument the following year. This has implications for broader conversations on treaties and intergovernmental approaches, particularly and potentially in relation to business and human rights, where a parallel discussion is ongoing in the Working Group on Business and Human Rights on having an intergovernmental treaty as well on business and human rights. So it's something to watch. We're certainly following the matter closely. The draft itself is not particularly strong, so of course there will be processes of negotiation, which of course is a member state process. We do not, we provide advice and evidence, but of course these are member state processes. But this was quite a significant milestone after many years of discussion on such a development. Rokaya mentioned the resolution on digital and privacy. This isn't the first resolution of its kind at the Council. There's been a number on the same topic. The content of this resolution, I don't think really advances much more beyond what the previous resolutions were, but in the context of the many developments that have taken place this year, particularly the advent of ChatGPT and the important strides on artificial intelligence since the last resolution, it does reinforce the right to privacy. It speaks specifically about the discriminatory barriers faced by historically marginalised groups in terms of digital access. It reiterates very important points, which of course we're very cognizant of in UNDP. So it's kind of an update, let's say, of the previous processes, but I don't think it particularly adds a great deal of new thinking and text. You can find an analysis of that in the summaries, of course. Then a couple of the country resolutions to mention. There was many interesting resolutions, but I'll only mention a couple here because we want to see if anyone has any comments or questions. There was a resolution on the situation on Sudan, which established a fact-finding mission. This is a specific development to advance and augment already the expert processes in relation to Sudan, a specific establishment of a fact-finding mission. This continues to be a trend now that we're seeing at the Council. More and more country settings, discussions on country settings are taking measures to establish fact-finding missions. So something that a few years ago wasn't that common is now becoming sort of a regular tool that the Council is turning to. And again, we see this in Sudan in the resolution that was established. That was adopted. There was an interesting resolution on Cambodia, which is not a country that usually is usually as prominent as many others in the conversations at the Council, specifically on advisory services and technical assistance in relation to access to justice for Cambodia, which I think will be very interesting for rule of law and colleagues in Asia Pacific. And there's also a very interesting resolution in relation to the Caribbean community, which called for the opening of a regional office of the Human Rights Office of OHCHR in the Bahamas to help to address human rights challenges in the Caribbean sub-region. So these are some specific resolutions we draw your attention to, but there were also resolutions on Afghanistan, on Burundi, on the Russian Federation, on Yemen, specifically on women's political participation, on Honduras, also on rule of law, which was very interesting, on the Democratic Republic of Congo, and on Somalia. So without going into any more detail at this point, noting we have just a few minutes left for this update, we'd be interested to know if anybody has any of their own observations from following the Council sessions, or any questions, or wants to share any perspectives on any of the information we've shared. Before we close out, we'll give you a small overview of the next session and what that's going to hold coming early 2024. But please indicate if you want to take the floor or put something in the chat. Respond to anything that we've said in this conversation so far.
While we let our colleagues think, if you may have any questions, maybe just to mention also that during the 54th session, there were UPR adoptions. So a few, 14 countries. And I'll mention just a few that, so 8 of them are UNDP program countries, right? So we have Mali, Montenegro, Botswana, Bahamas, Burundi, Barbados, and Serbia, as well as Tonga. So if you are working in these countries or through the region supporting these countries, there is also some information specifically on the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review process, and the adoption of that.
Thanks, Rukaya. We have specific tools and guidance on support to UPR follow-up and recommendations you can also find on Spark Blue, or feel free to reach out to us. One other development, which is also mentioned, of course, in the summary, is there was 12 new appointees for special procedure mandate holders. So the special rapporteurs that we often work with in our work, 12 new appointees were confirmed. And this ranges from the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, the Counterterrorism Special Rapporteur, the Rights of Migrants, and so on and so forth. So you can find a list of those new mandate holders. And if you have ongoing engagement with them, it would be useful to update yourself in terms of the new mandate holders. And of course, if you need to be in touch with them, we can also help you, put you in touch with the relevant OHCHR office. We have a question from Madeline. Is there information online? Yes. The link that Rukaya has put in the chat is to an executive summary, which is basically, if you don't want to read all the more in-depth analysis of all the sessions we covered, you can skim the executive summary, and that gives you really the highlights, including the resolutions. But for the sessions that UNDP specifically followed, there's also summaries per week, which goes into the specific sessions. So we did follow some of the resolutions on countries, not all of them, because we don't have the capacity to follow all of them. And in the conversations, in the summary of the country resolutions, you can find, for instance, what the position was of member states, particularly, of course, the state under review. Many of the countries that were being reviewed, of course, many of them object to the process itself and have their own view on some of the findings that are being presented. So a summary of those positions of those states is also included in that more deep weekly summary. But if you just want a short, sharp overview, please just look at the executive summary, which is the link that Rukaya has put in the chat on our Global Human Rights Spark Blue page. And in any case, within that, you can link to that and it will take you to the executive summaries, which give you much more information on all the countries and the resolutions. So does anybody else have any questions? Please just feel free to turn your camera on and take the floor. We have, I think, 3 minutes before we'll close out. Okay, well, we'll take the silence to be great, great welcoming of the information that we've imparted to you. And please feel free to peruse the materials that we've shared. The next council session is Human Rights Council session 55. We don't have the exact dates yet. It usually starts on the second week of February, sometimes first week. It's usually a very busy session. One of the distinguishing features of that session is that it has a high-level political segment on the first day, where ministers of foreign affairs and heads of state speak, and usually the administrator also provides his vision of the human rights context and globally. So it's an important point in the calendar for UNDP and other UN leaders to talk about the human rights challenges and opportunities they see vis-a-vis their mandates at the very senior levels. So that's a very important aspect of the February session, which we'll be preparing for. But then there's many other country contexts, thematic discussions, and so on and so forth. Each of the thematic sessions occur in different parts of the calendar in the council, so you won't see the same thematics coming up in each session, although sometimes they're doubled up. So we'll be sharing with you the agenda with your team leaders and with the regional advisors and regional bureaus of that session when we get it. And if there's any particular discussions or dialogues you want us to follow that are of interest to you, or where you feel you want to share some UNDP work or perspectives, then please reach out to Rakaya, myself. I want to acknowledge Viola Santini, who's unwell today, who's the intern who did fantastic work on this report, but I think is a bit under the weather, so isn't presenting. But Viola, thank you for all your great efforts. And with that, we'll leave this just now, and thanks for your time.